Certainly, we were not expecting 7.6%. We were in line with consensus at 7.4%. So this was a surprise to our expectations, but also the fact that it's a surprise even on the upside in terms of relative to the previous number of 7.5%. But even when we look at core inflation, it went up to 5%. Consensus was 4.9%, so there was an expectation that it was going to edge up slightly, but it edged up slightly more than what was expected. So it simply says to us, inflation is now broadening into the economy overall. It's not just a supply side story, there's a demand side story, because we see core inflation continue to creep up, which is what the central bank is going to be responding to, given that it's not moderating as fast as it should back into the target, which means it's going to take some time before we see it within the target.
I think enlighten us a little bit on how we're getting there. I mean, it is the average everyday South African is going to feel, or is already feeling the pinch and is going to continue doing so. How did we get here? How did we get to not even being able to predict what those inflation numbers would look like, and then them coming out worse? What's contributing towards those numbers? I suppose that's the question.
But the inflation story starts before COVID. The Trump taxes from 2016 meant that many countries has to insource production, which implied that they had to invest a lot in their own production processes to take production that was in other countries back to their own countries. And that fueled demand. But also the tariffs which China and the US imposed on each other caused inflation. Then entered the pandemic. We could not produce the goods that are required in the manufacturing process. The shortage of chips and semiconductors also contributed into an inflationary spiral. Then we had the central bank response and fiscal authorities respond to COVID, which meant households had a lot of savings. Yeah. When the economy started to open up, those savings were spent, which then contributed to a demand side story to inflation. The Ukraine issue impact on energy and grain prices impacted also food price inflation. So all in all, the major contributors in the current environment, it's food, it's energy prices. Right. But the inflation story predate COVID.
Yeah, so we had some reprieve during COVID-19 from the Reserve Bank and the Monetary Policy Committee. Clearly this year, that reprieve over. Projections saying 50 to 75 basis points up tomorrow. What do you think it's going to look like when we hear from the Reserve Bank governor tomorrow?
More likely a 75 basis point than a 50 basis point. But even after this, MPC decision tomorrow, we still expect further hikes next year in the first quarter, because we are not seeing a turnaround in inflation expectations quickly enough. They have been rising away from the midpoint towards 5%, and to prevent those inflation expectations being anchored at a structurally higher expectation than the 4.5%, the SAB would have to respond. So it's not just an SA story alone. Yes. We see it in the advanced economies. The US expected to hike by 75 basis points. The Bank of England expected to continue to hike way after the US have peaked. The European Central Bank also expected to continue to hike. And that says to us, we are still in an environment where central banks are expected to continue to hike rates, especially because inflation remains quite sticky outside of targets and being slow to come back within targets.
Yeah, so I mean, we're wrapping up the year. It is going to be that final announcement tomorrow. Going into 2023, what are we to expect? And I want to talk about this now before we go and we spend our December bonuses, so that we're able to start planning for the year ahead if we are going to continue to be under pressure in 2023.
Indeed, 2023 is likely to be more difficult than 2022. Global growth expected to be weaker. If we look from an inflation perspective, still quite sticky. Interest rates, at least for the first half of the year, will be at their peak in this cycle. And of course, fuel prices will continue to remain elevated given the continuation of the Ukraine-Russia war and the fact that Europe will be stockpiling on those diesel supplies because they have a terrible winter given the energy prices that they're experiencing. So in the domestic economy, growth is expected to weaken, unemployment rate continue to remain elevated, interest rates will remain a binding constraint, at least as far as consumer affordability is concerned. And the load shedding that we have been listening and address earlier on will remain a binding constraint on growth. So it's going to be tougher next year than it is this year.
Sure. It's tough to hear. It's difficult to hear, Isaah. Thank you so much for speaking to us, though, and for really that sobering discussion and what it is we need to be preparing ourselves for as South Africans. Isaah Mhlanga is the chief economist for Alexander Forbes, essentially saying even going into 2023, you're going to have to continue tightening those belts.
Thanks, Naledi. The revamped Mkhuze Regional Airport is expected to boost tourism in Kganyago in northern KwaZulu-Natal. It's been revamped to the tune of some 100 million rand. The airport is amongst the 9 regional airports in the province getting a facelift.
The Mkhuze Regional Airport, in the heart of northern KwaZulu-Natal, it's surrounded by some of the province's richest tourism destinations. Pristine natural landmarks like the Ismangaliso Wetland Park and Hluhluwe Imfolozi Game Reserve are nearby. Plans are for the airport to bolster these economic drivers and to create jobs for the youth. Charter flights connecting KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga are expected to start from Easter next year.
We're also waiting for 6 new caravans to arrive, so that will also take some time. Caravans arrive, any aircraft arriving will obviously have to go through the CAA processes, getting certified, registered, and etc. And that can take some time as well. But hopefully by Easter we will have a better understanding, if not even operating by then.
South Africa's first World Heritage Site has welcomed the move.
This is going to have a significant impact in terms of the numbers of tourists who are flowing into Ismangaliso. Now, it will make it easier for our tourists if they were to land here in Mkhuze and drive a shorter distance. In fact, they will spend more time in our game reserves than spending more time on the road.
Tourism is expected to be a key driver for the airport.
It is not going to operate as an island, and I'm sure from now onwards we understand, because this one solely must address the issue of tourists. So it is an attraction of tourism in this area. It is going to be contemplating on addressing that instead of you landing in Durban and driving for the next 3 hours, just land straight to Mkhuze area.
In terms of the niche from Mkhuze Airport, we are looking at 3 areas. The first one is obviously the scheduled passengers, where on a daily or twice a week, we would then have an airline that will fly service Mkhuze Airport. But obviously, as you have heard in the meeting, FedAir wants to launch a daily flight to Mkhuze Airport.
Government is finalizing plans to woo airlines to the airport, insisting there are strategies to prevent it from becoming a white elephant. Mlondi Khatebe, SABC News, Mkhuze.